As my date ends, I am left to reflect on the evening with my friends. It is very interesting how easy it is for others to see what we cannot, and vice versa. This is the case as I begin editing my peers' papers. Very easily, I am able to tell a friend when she is confusing her audience with her varying topics and lack of. In this first semester of English, I had to introduce myself to a course I was completely unfamiliar with and begin learning all about the FYC guidelines and goals of the overall class. I was nervous. I went from years of writing 5-paragraph essays to being told that I would be learning a completely new way of writing. Just like my dating life, I learned throughout the semester how I have a strong sense of audience awareness, yet suffer from random tangents that show my lack of coherence throughout my pieces. It is through English 1101 that I managed to confront my lack of coherence, hone my ability to connect to my audience, and thereby win over my freshman year English course for a chance at a second date. My first date begins with my biography. In the biographical photo essay, I tell my audience about my strong connection with my church camp and how it has shaped who I am today. This essay really strengthens me as a writer because it makes me go beyond thinking that relationships only occur between people. I embrace the truth that a lot of times it is the places in our lives that affect how we grow the most as people. This project really helps with the goal of using electronic environments to share text, because it helps strengthen my relationship with my audience by showing them the place in my life that shaped me, rather than just telling them. Also, through the connections I had with this camp, I go on to say how it helped cultivate many of my social relationships, as well as my relationship with God. Through the goals set by this semester's course, I am able to grow significantly as a writer, and really develop further the idea of relationships shaping who I am as a person. My date is able to see a piece of who I actually am through this project, and I'll try to be modest, but he liked what he saw. Through the use of electronic environments, my little quirks or grammatical errors do not overshadow who I am as a person. I was rewarded with an A on my assignment and a smile from my date as I move on to tackling my first written essay. As the evening progresses, I begin struggling to find the right things to say and watch as my date tries to keep up with all of my random statements. The roller coaster ride of a date soon takes its first downhill plummet as my essay struggles with a loss of direction that begins to confuse my audience. I learned in my first paper the importance of supplying actual facts rather than simply stating my personal observations and opinions. This realization helps me catch some of my flaws, attempt to clarify my argument, and help develop some of my audience awareness. However, biased statements and a lack of concrete evidence are still present throughout my paper. My inclusion of random opinions causes a lack of coherence that is needed to connect my ideas back to my thesis. From my argument about selfish tendencies tearing apart relationships and say how, quote, this idea of using sexuality as a means of control has the mark of our media stamped all over it, and shows the true distortion that has been given to the meaning of relationships and love in general, unquote. Although this is a true statement, it in no way contributes to the thesis I am trying to prove. My true identity, like my thesis, cannot be seen when there are so many ideas that do not properly work together to prove my point. However, even in my struggle for coherence, I remain aware of my audience. The pained look on my date's face leads quickly to a shift of subject, so I eagerly move on to Essay 2. Just as things start to look up on my date, I mess up again. Despite being very aware of my audience, my lack of concrete evidence illustrates a lack of control in my second essay. This idea of control is necessary when connecting ideas. However, it is better to let the ideas connect with each other as naturally as possible, without twisting it to say what you want it to. The idea of emotional appeals is to strengthen your paper and draw your audience in, which is why Paper 2 helps me understand the importance of not only critiquing my own work, but also the work of others. As I focus on the relationships between the emotional appeals in my classmates' papers, I am able to see the defects in my own work. The ability to help someone else with their paper really strengthens my own skills and my confidence in writing. It is through the connections made between logos, ethos, and pathos, which I discuss in my second essay concerning rhetoric, that the writer is not only able to strengthen the relationship connecting their ideas together, but also the relationship with their audience on an intellectual and emotional level. My second essay does a slightly better job of coherence. However, my lack of defining terms early on makes the rest of the paper suffer. In my intro paragraph, I say how Oberkofler's paper's, quote, lack of relating back to the argument causes bad logos and undermines what good pathos he has in his paper, unquote. This is a worthwhile point. However, since I had not yet defined logos or pathos, my audience is left to feel confused or, in a date-like setting, just plain uncomfortable. Also, with my inclusion of words such as good and bad, I demonstrate my struggle with biased statements that work against my own logos. My second essay, although not totally successful, teaches me a lot about the course and myself as a writer. Discussing topics sooner than you should is not successful on a first date, just like the argument about emotional appeals is not appropriate when they have yet to be defined. As my date ends, I am left to reflect on the evening with my friends. It is very interesting how easy it is for others to see what we cannot, and vice versa. This is the case as I begin editing my peers' papers. Very easily, I am able to tell a friend when she is confusing her audience with her varying topics and lack of cohesive thoughts. A peer review of Sarah Bromley's paper is similar to this. When describing her movie poster, she says, quote, "The red coloring shows the viewer the dominant difference between the two worlds because many do not associate the two together as they are placed in the title. Once again, the designers use colors and font to illustrate the major difference between the two," unquote. This argument is valid as she tries to illustrate the distinction between good and evil. However, she does not prove her thesis about there being a difference between being part of a religion and having faith. Inability to connect concrete evidence to her thesis is an issue of coherence that I suffer from as well. This advice ends up proving to me my own faults when it comes to writing, and also shows me the strength I have in relating well to others despite this fault. My other friend gives very little concrete evidence to prove the thesis of her paper. This was the case with Manila Isaac's paper. Isaac says, quote, "The writer's example of real-life experience did reflect the pathos element, but it also went against it. She's comparing her bad experience to everybody else. She's making a generalization and assuming that everyone had an unfortunate experience like her," unquote. She references the writer's example, however, her lack of concrete evidence makes it difficult for me as her audience to feel convinced of what she's saying. This shows me how important logos is, and how even though at times my logic isn't clear, it is still usually present sporadically throughout my pieces. Through helping my friends work through their problems, I realize more clearly the issues I struggle with and how I can confront and fix them. After the constructive words from friends, I am left with my self-revision. By working with my friends on their issues and tearing apart my previous work, I am able to choose my piece to revise and thereby improve my first impression for my next date. For example, in my first essay, I went back and removed a lot of generalizations and personal opinions, thereby strengthening my audience's trust in what I was saying. Also, I made sure to connect everything I was saying back to my main thesis, which helped my coherence and overall rhetoric. For my second essay, I went back and strengthened my logic by defining all of the emotional appeals early on, before I began using the terms loosely throughout my paper. Through the editing of these pieces, I was able to connect even better with my audience with less distractions and random comments that didn't contribute to my thesis. Revising my own work became the best way to prepare me for my upcoming second date, the wild card. After learning a lot about myself as a writer, I feel more confident going in blindly to an assignment with very few guidelines or restrictions. I now know to speak clearly, provide concrete evidence, and show my date who I am through my writing. I decide to write an essay on marriage that goes along with my original movie poster. I delve into the misconceptions about marriage and how its role in our society has been skewed throughout our generation. My audience awareness and logos is heightened through my use of references. I refer to Christina Simmons' book, Making Marriage Modern. I say how, quote, "She delves deeply into the areas of sexual movements and independence from the sole idea of marriage and nothing else. She says radicals rejected community and state surveillance and control of sexual relationships and activities, calling instead for individual freedom. This radical view seems to have become the norm in America. This unfortunately results in a selfish desire to please the individual, as is shown by Kutcher's first relationship where he sleeps with one girl for fun, no strings attached," unquote. In this excerpt, I show my awareness of the emotional appeals by providing concrete evidence for my audience to further prove my point. My audience awareness is heightened through the use of references, just like plainly laying out my favorite color and favorite hobbies for my date. It is a quick way for my date to get to know me so we can ask deeper and more thought-provoking questions. This makes me feel closer with my audience because they are able to quickly relate to my writing if any evidence mentioned reflects aspects of their own lives. Also, by providing examples, I am strengthening my readers' confidence in my own writing. I now clearly connect back to my purpose without the confusing ramblings that had once vexed my writing. It turns out my wild card is my chance to have a successful second date and maybe a full-blown relationship. Experience in English 1101 has become a relationship similar to that of a first date, filled with its share of ups and downs. Throughout my pieces, I mingle with my audience, pretty well aware of their responses, but struggle with how to get past the awkward moments to show them who I really am. The curriculum of English 1101 was initially an intimidating list that I was unfamiliar with. However, the goals set by FYC have greatly affected my works of writing throughout the semester. I learned through the incorporation of logic and all the emotional appeals that my audience is more receptive when they can not only understand my paper, but also relate to it. A common thread among all of my pieces is that of relationships, whether it is relationships between ideas, relationships with a place, or even relationships with someone on your first date. As it turns out, dates, although painfully awkward at times, are crucial to developing who you are as a person, and for me, who I am as a writer.